And I know in stalking you online, I found that the first thing you wrote was in second grade. When did you go from wanting to write slam poetry and fun things to knowing that you wanted to write actual fiction and pursue specific books for young adults, or is that what you want to do?
Yeah, so even though I am very happy to be in the middle grade space now, and it makes total sense that I'm here and I plan to be here for a while, I did not in my mind ever think about actually writing for young people as I was growing up. Writing initially or storytelling was actually just a means for survival for me. So, I'm listing all these sort of heady, serious inspirations. But for me, when I was growing up, because we can talk about this a little bit later, but because I'm also adopted and I grew up in a white family, and so this book is inspired by some of my experiences and emotional things that I went through growing up. But for me, growing up, writing became a way to like put down some feelings I had and some questions I had about my experience in the world compared to my parents or my other family members. And so I kept meticulous journals and diaries, some of them observing the world around me, some of them sort of all about my internal sort of turmoil and questions about my family versus, what about a family that I came from. And so for a while, that was what writing was for me. I think in high school, it shifted into this is something that I want to pursue and a craft that I want to work on. And for me, that was through poetry. So I mentioned that I went to a boarding school. I had the opportunity my senior year of high school to go to Interlochen Arts Academy, which is a arts camp and boarding school in northern Michigan. And when you go there as an academy student, you pick a major. And so I had gone for summer camp as a musician because my family is musical. And music taught me a lot about like how you practice something to get good at it. But writing really was the thing that I was like, I love doing this. I want to continue to do this and get better at it. So when I went for my senior year, I actually went as a creative writing major, and then put together a poetry thesis as a high school student, to graduate from that program. And so it was really that point where I was like, well, that's what I want to pursue. I want to be a poet. I want to write poetry. I want to publish books. I still love reading fiction. I love nonfiction, but that sort of became the focus. And then I went into college and I found the slam poetry spoken word community scene there. I was on University of Michigan's like national slam team for 2 years and went to nationals and competed with other dramatic college students, all of us writing very raw poetry about our lives and our experiences. And then, after college, I was like, all right, I know I want to teach, but I also want to continue to pursue writing. And so I pursued my master's in education, but was always finding ways to still be performing or writing, or I had a lot of friends who were writers, so be sharing work with each other. And so this book for Black Girls Like Me actually technically started as my master's thesis and was actually a collection of poetry that was much more abstract and played around with form a lot more. But it was a collection of poems all in the voice of this 11-year-old girl. And it was much more autobiographical than this book is. But I graduated from my MFA program with, a 60-page poetry thesis that was about a girl who was adopted. And so there were these little vignettes of poems that kept coming back. And then I sort of struggled to figure out what to do with that, or how I was going to be a writer in the world after that program. But I published an essay about my experiences growing up as an adoptee in BuzzFeed. And from that essay, I got an email from my now editor asking if I'd considered writing a story inspired by my own story with a young Black girl who was adopted as a protagonist. And that is how I ended up in the kid lit in the, middle grade space, because once it sort of clicked with me that I could maybe take sort of the bones of this poetry manuscript, I was like, well, I've been writing about this 11-year-old girl forever, and sort of then change it, make it more plot driven, think more about the characters, fictionalize it. That is what became For Black Girls Like Me. And I was definitely feeling stagnant with the previous manuscript and didn't know what to do. And sort of when this became a path forward, it was really, really fun and rewarding to sort of jump into writing this for a middle grade perspective. It was a very long answer to
No, it was a great answer. I'm just trying to think of all the follow-up questions I have. One, I can't let pass because it's just a dumb question to satiate my own ignorance. How does one compete in slam poetry, and how do you know who's won? Haven't we all won if we all get to hear great poetry?
This is a great question. Obviously, it's very subjective, but there is a form to slam poetry. So basically, if you are competing in a slam, you put your name down, and then you have 3 minutes to deliver a poem. You're not allowed to use props. You don't have to memorize it, but you should. You should be sort of like off script because when you're reading off of a paper, that takes away from your performance a little bit. And then, honestly, the way a poetry slam is judged is people from the audience volunteer to be a judge. And then you get a score. And your score is, 0 through 10. If the person running the slam is a kind person, they instruct people that you should never give anyone like less than a 5. Like you should never do that. But sometimes people would. And then, after you do your poem, you get a score. And I think there are 5 judges or so. And so maybe 3 or 5, I can't remember, depending on how it's being run. And so you get your score. And then there are 2 rounds. So if you make it through the first round, then you can repeat a poem in the second round. So the judging is there on the spot, often by just audience members, some who may have come there specifically to see a slam, some who just might be in the establishment that the slam is happening in. And then for like the national ones that are a little bit more like just like a college, college football team is going to play another team where you're taking your slam team to another institution to compete against other colleges. Sometimes they bring in like poets or authors from the areas to be the judges for those. But again, it's really subjective. You're supposed to get judged on, your performance, your writing, and then the delivery and the creativity. But that can be really subjective. So in some ways, I guess in some ways you should feel like you've all won because you're getting a chance to get up on stage and, say a poem out loud. But it can get really competitive, and it was a really important community for me growing up, especially in college. Some of my dearest friends still I met through going to poetry slams every Thursday night at the University Union at University of Michigan. But it's hard to tell. It's like, how do you judge a poem? That's still a good question. I don't know if there's a good answer for it.
Is it possible to commit a foul at a poetry slam?
Yes, if you go past the 10-second grace period, so if you are reciting your poem, you get to that 3-minute mark, someone is timing you, and then you have a 10-second grace period. If you go past that, then absolutely you can be disqualified, honestly, if you go past the time. And then if you use props, if you're using like props on stage with you to sort of convey your story or your poem, that's also kind of a foul as far as poetry slams go.
So Carrot Top's out. He's not gonna be able to win the slam.
No. You can do group poems. So that you can have, 2 or 3 people come up and do a piece together. It still has to be under 3 minutes or under. So I also had these like late nights staying up instead of cramming for whatever exam I should probably have been cramming for. I was like writing a group piece with my friends and figuring out how to fit it all together. So it also was a lot about community as well.
So my experience I know lots of poets. My experience is rather limited to poems that rhyme and are more jokey than anything else. Because anything more than that, we're getting too close to my emotions. Careful now. Word you off a little bit. What does performing that poetry and competing with the poetry, how does that change your poetry from just sitting quietly and thinking just to yourself and, maybe burying it all? Who was it? Is it Emily Dickinson that just put all the poetry away and then died and then was discovered after the fact? What's the difference of being so extroverted with your poetry, and how does that improve your poetry?
I think there's benefit. I don't think that there's a right necessarily way to perform or write poetry. You know, some poets, their poems live on the page, and that is wonderful and perfectly fine. And some poetry is meant to be spoken, and that is also valid and wonderful, and it's all poetry. I think what I felt when I first, stumbled upon that Saul Williams poem that was like spoken out loud, and then when I went to my first poetry slam at University of Michigan, what I felt was that there was a way of inviting people in sort of real time that maybe didn't happen as much when I was reading a poem on the page. And so there was a real sense of community, and also even if you've prepared a poem, you're not going to perform it the same way twice necessarily, right? Like each performance is in its own way sort of a live performance, and it's only going to happen that way once. And so you're inviting a group of people in a room to sort of experience that with you, and to be in that moment with you in a way that I think is different. I think you're still having a moment and an exchange when you're reading a poem on a page. That's also equally important. But for me, I felt there was a lot of power in that community. And then also a lot of power in standing up and trying to get to some type of truth with your poetry. I think the first time I went to a slam and I saw, a person who was my age get up on stage and, spit a poem that was talking about some like really real emotions and things that person was going through, something clicked to me like, oh, I can get up and I can work some things out on the mic. And I did. I'm also really glad that YouTube was not a thing when this was happening. There would certainly be more film of me on YouTube doing slam poetry if that had been a thing, but it wasn't yet. So I got.
You had some material you just needed to work out before you got the good stuff.
I wrote some really dramatic, self-portraits, and I worked some things out on the mic, but I also felt like it was a space that I could do that. And that there was a really powerful and beautiful exchange that happened. And so it was people getting up and being vulnerable in this way that I hadn't seen before, and giving themselves and other people permission to be vulnerable on the mic. And then also just the sort of beauty and act of oral storytelling. I think there's such power in listening to a story and then speaking a story, as well as there is reading something on the page. And so that was really important to me. And so I read some really dramatic poems of my own. I became really good friends with people. And then we, like I said, would cram and stay up all night and, rewrite, do retellings of things, or put our poems together. We'd put our poems to music. And it was just a really wonderful community for me to be a part of when you're on a big campus and you're trying to figure out who your people are as well.
And obviously it didn't detract from your academic work, because you stand before me today with 2 masters. So that got done as well.
It did, although I definitely pushed it in some classes where it was like, turn in a 6-page paper, and instead I just turned in a poem. And so I definitely got called out by some teachers who were like, I can tell you're a really talented, poet, but you need to write like an academic paper for this. So, I tried. I pushed it as hard as I could in some classes.
And do you still compete in slam poetry? Are you planning a triumphant return?
I don't. I haven't. I did that a lot in college, and then a little bit after college when I moved out to San Francisco, Oakland, Bay Area. I think what I sort of shifted that energy into was teaching and supporting young people who wanted to write spoken word and slam poetry. And so I found myself judging. I've been a judge before, and working with organizations like Youth Speaks in San Francisco, or there's an organization in Ann Arbor, Michigan called the Neutral Zone. So sort of turning my attention to the way that slam poetry, spoken word poetry can also give a lot of power and agency to young people is sort of where I shifted that energy. Because as I went into grad school, for writing, I started to experiment a little more with sort of blending a bunch of different forms together. So taking what I had learned from performing on the stage, and then also, I was taking fiction classes, nonfiction classes, and then also all my poetry classes. Some of them were about craft. Some of them were about producing more writing, about the business of writing. And so all of those things sort of like blended together. And I stopped performing, but I think that performance background has also helped me in a lot of different ways in various different jobs as I continue to work with young people and then write for young people.
So you kind of become a coach, it sounds like.
Yeah. In some ways a coach. There you go.